Good evening. How are y'all doing? Good. Okay. Winston, thank you for sharing that story. That was really inspiring. I don't run, but you made me want to for about a minute. You can run for me next time. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to hearing everybody else share their stories tonight. If I could just get you to think for a moment, imagine living in an environment that feels like a war zone, where you're afraid to open the blinds in your home, you're afraid to look out the window, you're expecting squad cars, police, at your door, at your gate, and you've been conditioned to believe that everybody outside of your home is the enemy, and they're out to get you. They're going to kill you. They're going to destroy your family. They're going to take everything away from you that you've ever worked for. Imagine waking up to that every day and facing that every day with 2 kids, and then realizing that the bigger source of conflict, the bigger war zone, actually lives within your home and is poisoning you every step of the way, convincing you that everything you believe is a lie, is stupid, that you're stupid for believing it, that you don't know anything and you can't survive without them. That was my marriage, 14 years. I was in that environment. It didn't happen overnight. He didn't greet me like that on our first date, for sure. He was my knight in shining armor. He said and did everything I ever thought I wanted to hear. He somehow intuitively knew everything I needed, and he listened to me like nobody else had ever listened to me. He swept me off my feet. He was generous, handsome, rich, took me on trips. I'd never felt like a princess before, and he made me feel like one. And then we got married, and things changed. And he became my nightmare. And everything he'd ever learned about me, he used against me. He used it as a weapon in an argument with me. He used it to beat me down. He used it to keep me under his thumb and to make it so that all my relationships outside of him suffered. But like I said, it didn't happen overnight. Have you heard the story of the frog in the pot of water on the stove, and the frog's in there, thinks this is awesome, right? Life is good. It's everything he's ever wanted. And you slowly turn up the heat until he's cooked and he hasn't even noticed it. That's kind of what it was like. It was just a little systematic drip every few days. And I didn't know if I was going to meet the man that I married or the monster I was married to in a 5-minute span. Like, he could switch like that. And I didn't know which it was going to be. So I felt constantly like I was on shifting sand. No really strong place to land except for with him, because he was the only constant. And then I knew things had to change the day we were out as a family, and he threatened to punch my 6-year-old son in the mouth. And I knew something had to change. He had never been violent, but I knew that it was getting close. He had raised his fist. And I didn't know what I was going to do or how I was going to do it. I hadn't worked outside of the home for 14 years. I had no income. I was completely financially dependent on him. Unbeknownst to me, he had helped himself to checks in my name, credit in my name, credit cards in my name, mortgages in my name, and had racked up some nice debt for me. But I knew that I had to leave because he was starting to threaten violence. So I tried my best to figure it out. And then one day in February of 2011, I took my kids swimming, and then I took them to homeschool science class. They were 6 and 10 at the time. We were homeschooling them. And while I was waiting for them to finish their class, he called me on my phone, and I answered it, and he said, "Don't bother coming home. I've changed the locks. There's lots of hotels." And then he hung up. And that was the last thing he said to me, ever. So that was February 27th, 2011. 3 o'clock Friday afternoon, 2 kids, me, clothes on our back, my car. And that was about it. The next 2 years were a panic. I barely remember those years, and they were definitely a struggle. He apparently has left the country to avoid child support, which is actually a good thing. About 2 years after we got through the panic, I sold the house, we moved. I helped my kids adjust to the abandonment, to feeling they felt like it was their fault. Every night they'd say to me, "Is this because I was bad?" And I had to reassure them, of course it wasn't because they were bad, while inside thinking it must have been because I was bad. there was something wrong with me if he would have done this to us. So about 2 years after that happened and going through the panic of relocating, I decided that it was a good idea at the time when this happened to grow a business. Even though I'd never run a business, I'd never done anything for myself, I'd never worked for myself, and all my friends and family were saying, put the kids in school and get a job. But something inside of me said that they didn't need another thing to adjust to. And something said, you can do this. So the first 2 years were a panic. I didn't know what I was doing or how I was doing it. I made a lot of mistakes. I screwed up a lot. My kids and I spent a lot of time crying and trying to figure out what the heck we were doing and make sense of something that didn't make sense. And then one morning I was working before they got up. That was my routine, to get up early in the morning and work before they got up and then spend time with them in their homeschooling and then work again after they went to bed. And my daughter came downstairs. I'd been working and I'd been feeling really positive and motivated and upbeat for a while. And I went to her as she came down the stairs and I put my hands on her shoulders and I gave her a hug. And I looked at her and I said, honey, we're going to make sure this was the best thing that ever happened to us. And she looked at me like I was batshit crazy, right? She's like, what are you talking about? How could this be a good thing? And from that moment on, I determined that this was going to be the best thing that could happen. And I learned that every one of your past events may define you, but you get to decide how they define you. You can choose to be a victim. Carol and I were talking about that earlier. Or you can just say, this happened to me, and I'm going to look at how I process it. Every day, I am thankful that he walked out the way he did. It was hard. It wasn't easy. But I've never had to send my kids for a weekend visit with somebody they didn't want to spend the weekend with that they were scared of. He's never paid a cent of child support, but I've supported my kids. And in a fairly expensive place to live, I figured out how to run a business. And so much good has come out of it. I will never let my kids be 20 or 30 years old crying because they don't have their dad. Because he made the choice to leave. Whatever mental issues he was going through, he made the choice. And they don't need to pine for him. That doesn't need to be a definition of who they are. So that was about 2013 when that moment happened. And there was a lot of ups and downs. I'm not saying it was super easy from that moment forward. I definitely had times when I was very down since then. But that was a very important lesson that came up for me. And every time an event happens that doesn't go exactly as planned, I get to remind myself, I get to choose how this defines me or how it impacts me. And I talk to my kids about that now too, every day, about things that happen that don't go the way they want. A 13-year-old son, for example, who thinks everything should go his way. I remind him, if it doesn't go your way, that's where the best learning happens. And then in about 2015, I was talking to a woman about being on a summit that she was putting together online. And we talked about my history and things that I'd gone through. And she said, oh, you've just done so much. And I immediately heard myself saying, oh, no, I haven't. No, what are you talking about? I haven't done anything. It's nothing, right? Immediately saying that I hadn't. And why was I doing that? Because I spent too much time looking at my newsfeed on Facebook with everybody's perfect life. Everybody's perfect hair, having dinner at sunset in Hawaii on the beach, and I could barely take my kids to Wendy's. Struggling to pay my rent every month, and I'm watching people's stories of their A game and comparing that to my B game, C game. I don't know. It was not an A game for sure. It was as good as I could do at the moment, and there was nothing wrong with it. But I immediately dismissed it because I was comparing myself to other people. And we talked a little bit more, and she said to me, think about where you were a year ago, or think about where you started. And we got off the conversation, and I spent some time thinking about it, and when I started realizing where I had come from, that in 2011, when my ex walked away from me, I couldn't decide how many cans of corn to buy at the grocery store by myself. I was asking my kids, do you think we should buy 2 cans or 3? Now when I look back, I go, that's crazy. How could I not have known that? Just that moment, I remember the corn. The corn is always going to be a thing for me, I guess. But I remember that moment, and now I look at all the decisions I make every day. And even though I felt like I wasn't moving forward as fast as I wanted to, I wasn't, out speaking internationally, being paid to speak at big events or writing my book or being invited to all the conferences that I wanted to go to, even though I was seeing other people do that, that didn't mean I hadn't accomplished anything. Even if I wasn't making massive steps forward, I was still moving forward every day in my dreams. And I didn't look at the clock when I started. So my message of tonight is not about where we were, but about take every experience you have, and you can choose how it defines you and what you're going to do with it. And stop comparing yourself, if you do, to anybody but yourself a year ago, because that's the only true comparison. Thank you.